In a recent video game that I played, but will remain unnamed so I don't have to worry about spoiler tagging this example, a certain party member joined my character's group about halfway through the game. He seemed to have no reason for being in the party at all, just kinda got swept up along the way. And other than a slightly annoying verbal idiosyncrasy, was a welcome addition to the group. That is, until the point, about 3/4 of the way through the game, when he betrayed my character's party by giving a map-like item to the bad guys. My party needed the map to show them the way to the MacGuffin that they've been seeking for much of the game. And without that map, they had no way of knowing where to go. Later on in the game, after the betraying character performed a heroic sacrifice that saved the party, and performed a unique method of escaping that deadly encounter himself, the character apologized to the party for his betrayal and explained his reasoning for it. It seemed like it was the best thing to do for the party in his estimation. See, the people who tried to get where the map was showing were never seen again. He thought that if he sent the bad guys that direction, he could take care of them while keeping the party safe. Never mind the fact that the party would never have been able to get the game's main MacGuffin without going there. But what I really want to focus on in this illustration is the way that the party felt while in between the character's betrayal and his eventual return. Fear and despondency overcame them. Fear of directionlessness, fear of loss, fear that they had failed and were without recourse. And on top of that, they had lost what they thought was a true friendship, fearful to have ever been able to trust again. In similar situations, we'd feel very much the same. Betrayal leads to all sorts of fears. Fear that we've wasted our time. Fear that our mistake has left us in an impossible situation. Fear that nothing will change, except maybe to get worse. Fear that that person will do it all over again, if we ever let them near us. Fear is a byproduct of betrayal. The concepts of trust, betrayal, and fear come to the forefront in our passage for this sermon from 1 Samuel chapter 23. Themes that make sense in this point during David's storyline in our series called A Song of Failures and Hope. And this is because we're in the time frame where David's been a fugitive for a while. Saul wants his kingly successor dead, and will kill anyone who even looks like they've helped the son of Jesse in the tiniest way. God has called David to be within the lands of his tribal ancestors, but that also means being within the grasp of the raving madman who seeks his life. The whole situation just reeks of trust issues, fear, and eventual betrayal. But through it all, David remains faithful to God, ever ready to seek God's way, instead of trusting his own fears of the situation. 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 1-5. Now they told David, Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. This section starts off in the midst of action. Some of David's men report to him that a city in western Judah has been having some trouble with the Philistines. I mean, what else is new? The lands of Israel that are near the cities of the Philistines are being raided. That's just another Tuesday for them. But throughout the book of Samuel, the Philistines are the representation of all those who stand opposed to God. The number one enemy that represents the problems and evils of this life. They're the main antagonistic force pointed at when the people cry out for God to send a savior. The big bads whom God's chosen king needs to put down. And since David is that chosen king, regardless of the fact that someone else sits on the throne of Israel, it's his job to step up and fight the enemies of God's people. I mean, David could have just sat back and said that Keilah is a fortified city. They have a wall that's sufficient to keep the Philistines out. That's why it's only the threshing floors, which are outside of the city, and not the city itself that's being raided. David could have said that since Saul is technically on the throne, protecting the people is his job. It's not my job, at least not yet. And I don't work overtime. David could have given in to the fear that his men have. The fear that says, if I go to help them, then Saul will know exactly where I am. Sorry, Keilah, it doesn't put me in an advantageous position to help you, so I can't. But David didn't do any of that. No, he heard that the uncircumcised Philistines were acting like God wouldn't hold them accountable for their actions. So he needed to show them otherwise. However, David wouldn't go into battle without direction from God. So he asks, And, he had the prophet Gad with him, and Abiathar the priest. One way or another, God would speak. And speak he did. God told David to go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. The salvation of the people of God was the important part. Not the fear, not the enemies, no, the people of God. This is why he should move. God would restore his people through his chosen king. But again, the men following David questioned the wisdom of the move. Keilah is not a strategic position. There they'd have to worry about Saul and retaliation from the Philistines. No war on two fronts will go well for the people in the middle. So David asks God a second time if this is a good move. It's not that David doubted God's original word. Rather, this proves that David considers the words of his troops. He's not an overbearing dictator, but a humble servant of God and of the people that he leads. But then when God's word comes back to him with an emphasis on, I will give the Philistines into your hand, David knew that this was the true and final word from God. He trusted him and saved the city, a trust placed in one who has never sold him out. Yet there was still wisdom in David's actions, because while he knows that he can trust God, other people can easily betray him. 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 6 to 13. When Abiathar the son of Ahimelech had fled to David to Keilah, he came down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. And Saul summoned all the people to war, to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, Bring the ephod here. Then said David, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah, to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. Then David said, Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will surrender you. Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. Verse 6 is a parenthetical comment to give us more understanding about what's going on with David's questions in the verses that follow. When Abiathar ran to David, like we saw in the last sermon, he brought with him the high priestly ephod. The thing that's important about this is the fact that built into the high priestly garb were devices known as the Urim and Thummim. These two items were used by the high priest to understand the will of God. Scholars debate about exactly how this pair of items worked, but basically you would ask a yes or no question, and the answer that comes up was divinely weighted to be the response. But before we get to the questions David asks, we have to look to why he needed to ask them. In verse 7, we see that Saul's spies have done their job of locating David in Keilah, and the rejected king's mind turns to its tactical setting. The way that the Hebrew writes it, it looks like Keilah had only one gate in his walled fortifications. One way in, one way out. And if David's inside, then there's only one place that Saul needs to be to catch him. No slipping out the back window this time, David. And if Saul needs to starve out a city of Israel in order to nab his fugitive, it'll be worth it to him. But notice one thing about Saul's actions. He just assumes that since events seem to be falling in his direction, that this is God's will. He never stops to ask God if this is the move for him to make. Unlike David, Saul just does whatever he wants and forges God's name to it. So Saul begins to muster his army. He's bringing every sword that he's got to this fight. But this also gives David's spies the ability to read the situation and report to him about the coming siege. David doesn't want another Nob situation. No more towns to fall because they helped him. Therefore he goes to ask God about what to do, and called Abiathar to bring the ephod. He has to ask yes or no questions, but in verse 11 he accidentally asks two questions. Will the people of Keilah betray me? And will Saul come down like I have heard? So the answer seems to just respond to the last asked question. Yes, Saul is coming to Keilah to come against you, my servant. Notice David's humility in continuing to call himself God's servant throughout the questions. But because of this mistake, the first question needs to be asked again. Will the people of Keilah betray me by handing me over to Saul? Again, the answer came back. Yes. Let's look at the response that David has here. David doesn't rage against these people that he's just saved. Doesn't scoff at people who'd betray a man who literally just rescued them from another enemy. He doesn't demand recompense for the predicted betrayal if he stayed. He doesn't do any of the things that most people in history would have done in this situation. Instead, he leaves them in peace and gets out of there before they have the opportunity to betray him. before they do what seemed to be the most beneficial thing for them. Never mind the fact that they'd be betraying the man with God on his side. So David and his 600-man army, notice how it's grown since the last time we counted, they get out of there. I can't help but wonder what's going through David's mind at this moment. Was this going to be the way things always would be? He'd help people, deliver them from trouble, and then they'd come to betray him? All for their fear of not being like the last town that helped the fugitive. Betrayal because they don't want to be caught in the mad king's crosshairs. Sure, David trusted God's promise of him being the next king of Israel. And while people might betray him, God continues to stand close to David. But I can't help wondering if there was that little digging doubt in the back of his mind that one day, God wouldn't quite be as faithful. Back in the passage, we see Saul call the whole campaign off because David had escaped the cage of Keilah's walls. Expedition placed on hold. He'd have to ferret out the little usurper another time. Which, if I'm honest, doesn't seem to be all that difficult, considering all the people who find David. And this includes Jonathan for a scene that stands as the crux of this whole chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 14 to 18. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. Some might be wondering why I call this the crux of our passage. Well, stylistically, this chapter of Samuel has a mirrored appearance. Like how in the previous section, verses 6 to 13, we had David nearly betrayed by the people of Keilah. Likewise, we'll see in the section after the one we're dealing with here, there will be an actual betrayal. Sorry, spoilers. Similarly, verses 1 to 5 and verses 24 to 29 have a very interesting parallel in the appearance of the Philistines. When this type of mirroring happens in Hebrew, the way that it works is that the central section of the passage is where the main point can be found. It's like a giant blinking arrow pointing at the middle part and going, pay attention to this. And so if the driving thought of the passage is to be found in these verses here, we should pay close attention to it and consider the application to come from here as well. So what do we see in these middle verses? David is on the run, from desert stronghold to desert stronghold, never staying anywhere long enough for Saul's spies to report back his position. David probably slept with his armor and weapon nearby. And guard rotations for the night's watch? And knowing David, he probably attempted to be on that schedule often. It was a tiring existence, never knowing how he was going to feed the 600-plus man army, along with the camp support. Always having to think of multiple steps ahead, having rendezvous points planned and secondary points if they were compromised. Every day, wondering if someone else would sell him out. Watchful and testing of every new recruit that continued to find him, even though Saul never seemed to be able to. I know that I would be running on fumes in that situation, and beginning to fear that one day my trust in God would fail. Perhaps you would too. Yet day after day, God continued to prove his grace toward David. He never sold his chosen king into the hand of Saul, never betrayed him. The fugitive was in God's hand, for restoration, not to be handed over, sold out, betrayed. It might not have looked like it from the day-to-day experience of sneaking around, glancing back over their shoulder, but God's presence and his provision were always there, even more present than the hounding of David's pursuer, just like how God is with we who follow Jesus, always there, ready with the provision that we need. There might be days or weeks or years where we feel like we're just existing, waiting for God to do something, feeling like he's forgotten us. But oftentimes we don't witness the powerful things that God is doing for us, the things that he's staving off, the things that he is keeping away from us. And it's important for us to remember that just because God is working his will, the goodness of his restorative plan, it doesn't mean that we get a life of ease and free passes. Life in the deserted wilderness wasn't easy for David. Sometimes being in the plan of God means living a fugitive's life. But no matter what our life looks like, it never means that God has betrayed us or handed us over into the hands of those who seek our harm. We are in his hands for restoration, not betrayal. We might be in the wilderness, in distress for as far as the eye can see, but we should never fear a betrayal from our God. The passage seems to reveal that David did have some fear like this. God doesn't have his messengers, whether angelic or human, tell others to fear not, unless fear has indeed taken hold of their hearts. And this is how Jonathan begins his words to David in verse 17. Fear not, my friend. Again, I have to point out that it's by God's divine will alone that Saul couldn't find David. Everybody else can, including the crown prince himself. Jonathan found his friend and came to speak the words that David needed to hear at the time. And those words indeed begin with, fear not. Don't let the fear of betrayal from God take hold. He'll never let you fall into the hands of Saul. God's got you in his own hands, for his own purpose to be king. God is trustworthy, and his promises as well. I know that it's difficult to live in light of that truth when you don't feel it. I've experienced that doubt too. But trust God in a way that you could never trust anyone else. Many will betray you, but God never will. These are the words that David needs to hear. Many of us need to hear them as well, I presume. But David has just nearly been betrayed by the people of Keilah, and he's about to be betrayed by some of the people from the surrounding areas. Those doubts and fears had already begun their assault on his trust in God. How much further would they have gotten if Jonathan hadn't been there to speak these words to David? The final time that these two friends would ever be in each other's presence. The pair make another covenant with each other, a reminder of covenantal faithfulness and humility. God will be faithful, so let's humbly submit to his will. With this refreshed trust in God, David faces the next betrayal. 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 19 to 23. Then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hakilah, which is south of Jeshimon? Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desires to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. And Saul said, May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him there. For it is told me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go with you, and if he is in the land I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah. The area of Ziph is in the land of Judah, and around where David and his men were hiding. Some of the people of the area, who thought that they were doing what was best, decide to sell out David. They go right up to Saul and tell him that David's been bouncing around the caves south of Jeshimon, and then tell their king to come down according to all his heart's desire. Notice again how David seeks God's will before he moves, but even the people know that Saul does according to his own heart's desires. He goes where he pleases, and then stamps God's signature over it. Look at verse 21. Just after the Ziphites tell Saul that they would betray David, the rejected king lays a blessing of God on them. May you be blessed because you have had compassion on poor little me. It's about as fake of a religious person as you can get. Oh, you're giving me what I want? Well, bless your heart. But if there's even a hint of keeping back a little bit for themselves, then they'd get the sharp end of the spear that Saul slept with. Or he'd have Doeg do the dirty deed for him. This is just like the person who constantly says, God bless, right up until they've been slighted. And you wonder how those new words could ever have come out of the same mouth. Notice, though, that the Ziphites' betrayal is not enough for Saul. He's heard of David's location several times before, and been on the move after him, but always just a day or two too late. That slippery little conniver always seems to be just a step ahead. So instead of just heading there right now, Saul has the people of Ziph stake out multiple locations. Try and see if there's a pattern to his migration in the wilderness. Then, after you know his system, come back here and tell me all that you know. I will make the son of Jesse into a son of death. And the people of Ziph go and do that very thing. Their betrayal very nearly complete. But God will never betray his humble servant. 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 24 to 29. And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told. So he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul, saying, Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. Being watched by the Ziphites, David and his men traversed the wilderness of Maon in the Arabah south of Jeshimon. Those are all just a bunch of place names to us. We don't really get it, something we probably skipped over. The words have probably already left your mind. They don't really mean much to us after all. but those names have meanings that might help us apply the passage to our lives a little easier. Maon has the idea of refuge, Arabah means desert, and Jeshaman is the word for desolation. So David and his men were in the refuge of the desert beyond desolation. You ever been there? Spiritually and psychologically speaking. Not just in the desert, but so far beyond it that you passed desolation weeks ago. It's been a wasteland for so many miles that you've forgotten the taste of any pleasing thing. Like the strawberries of the Shire. It's the place where you want to give up. Just quit. Be done with it. That's where David and his men were, just when the betrayal was about to hit. And hit it did. Saul's army came out of nowhere. Wide eyes and hurriedly put on armor fled the cave. They lost days if not weeks of provisions. But David's men had to move. Now. Alright, who was it who said, how can things get worse? David and his men ran. But Saul was right on his tail, snapping at his heels. It looked like this might just be the failure of trust in God. I mean, verse 26 has what's probably the most dramatic moment of David's story. David and his men are on one side of the mountain range, running as fast as they can, and Saul's army is on the other side, so close that David's men can tell that the ground between them is shrinking. Saul's gaining on them. It's the drama that cliffhangers are made of. But God doesn't leave us hanging. With Saul's prey in his eyesight, he hears word from a messenger. The Philistines have taken this opportunity to raid the land. So what you gonna do, Saul? Lose the nation while trying to keep it from the son of Jesse? Or go after the Philistines and find David another day? Realizing his priorities properly for this moment, Saul lets David escape and heads toward the Philistines. I wonder how hard he threw those spears at the Philistine ranks that day. But notice this. God used the enemy of his people to deliver from another enemy. The Philistines began this chapter as enemies that David had to deal with, but ended it as the means of his deliverance. There's an irony that leaves you chuckling after the breath-stealing drama of the seconds before. The weeping joy as we fall to our knees and breathe out a sigh of relief. It was so close. The betrayal of the people of Ziph nearly cost David everything. But he was in the hand of God, not sold into the hand of Saul. God's promise remained sure. Verse 29 ends the passage by telling us that David and his men went to the strongholds of En-Gedi. That area is one of the few parts of the desert where water is easily found. As a matter of fact, the spring at En-Gedi continually flowed, just like the grace of God. It's a splash of color in the midst of a barren landscape. That's the image of God's faithfulness in the midst of our difficulties. What it looks like when we're in the hand of God, for restoration, not betrayal. Life as a follower of Jesus won't be easy. Some among us will wonder if it's ever going to be easy. But God's faithfulness will prove itself, again and again. He's bringing us in line with his plan of restoration, a plan for the good of his people, even when we're seconds from defeat, far beyond desolation. There's no reason to fear when we're there. In some way, God is with us. Sure, we all want that miraculous, one-in-a-million-years kind of rescue. But God is with us even in the moments when it seems that he is silent. Those days when our own Sauls plot our demise, but are kept quietly from ever getting near us. There were far more days when God protected David in secret than that spectacular scene of a mountain chase. But in both types of days, we're called to trust in God and his restorative plan. He won't sell us out, will never betray us. Others will, and tell us that it's for our own good. But despite every human betrayal, we need not fear. Fear not, because the one in whose hands we find ourselves is faithful to never betray and wants our restoration.